The warp modifier will push vertices away from one selected object in the direction of a second selected object. Here, I have a plane. I've subdivided it a couple of times and then added a subdivision modifier to it, set to simple, so that we can get a reasonable amount of topology to work with. I'll add an empty and set it as a single arrow. This will be the object we warp from, and I'm going to leave this at the same coordinate as the plane. I'll add another empty, but this one can be the regular 3-axis shape, and position it a little above the plane. Now selecting the plane, we'll add the warp modifier to it. We'll select the object from and to, and the effect is immediately obvious. Before we adjust the settings, let's move the empty objects around and see how they affect the plane. I've labeled the arrow empty origin. Notice how it affects the mesh if I move it above or below the plane. Now let's do the opposite and move and rotate the empty that I've called target. Now that we have some interesting positioning, let's take a look at the modifier settings. I'll select the plane once again. Because we rotated the target empty, the mesh will stretch and lose volume along the way. We can click on Preserve Volume, and the warp won't appear as stretched. The strength control will allow us to reduce or increase the warp as a factor. Now, obviously, when set to 0, the factor is nothing, and 1 typically stretches all the vertices to the point of the target. But you can increase the strength considerably and have the mesh warp far beyond the target, or even away from it. I'll make a random selection of vertices and assign them to a group. Now we can use that group, or its inverse, to isolate what parts of the mesh are affected by this modifier. The fall-off setting will allow you to select the type of fall-off curve. You can also control the radius over which the fall-off curve is distributed. We can even use a texture to determine the pattern of the warp. Let's add something random, like the magic texture, and mess about with some of the settings. We may have to increase the subdivision surface modifier a bit in order to get a smoother results. Now the texture coordinates can be set to local, global, object, or even UV. I'm going to set it to object, and I'm going to use the target empty as the object. Now, by adjusting the settings on this modifier, we can get some really interesting results.